All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving deep into denial.
Which, by the way, is a lot more interesting than a certain river in Egypt.
Huh, right. And we've got some fascinating source material for this one. We're going to be unpacking this conversation between Carlos, who you might remember is an AI architect, and Casey, who's a mystic. And they kind of go head to head trying to figure out what denial really is and how it works.
Yeah, it's like a classic clash of perspectives, you know?
Totally. So picture this. You're eavesdropping on Carlos and Casey. Right off the bat, Casey jumps into this whole thing about denial being like a defense mechanism.
Yeah, like it's our subconscious trying to shield us from facing something difficult or painful,
Yeah,
which honestly makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
totally. So it's like, nope, not dealing with that right now. Brain, activate shields, or...
Yeah.
But what really struck me was how Casey was so captivated by how weird denial looks from the outside. Like, they even went so far as to call it temporary craziness at one point.
It's that disconnect, right? Like to the person in denial, everything probably seems totally normal. They might be totally oblivious to the fact that they're even avoiding something.
So they're blind to their own blind spots.
Exactly. And this is where Casey brings up the whole concept of the shadow.
Which, okay, can be kind of a tricky one to wrap your head around.
Right. Basically, the shadow is like all the parts of ourselves that we reject, that we repress. You know, those aspects of our personality, those thoughts or emotions that we just deem unacceptable.
So we're talking about the stuff we shove way down deep and try to pretend isn't there.
Exactly. And denial becomes a way of keeping those shadow elements from bubbling to the surface.
Which I guess is why it can be so hard to deal with, right? Like
Sure.
trying to grab onto smoke. So it makes you wonder, do you think some people are just more prone to denial than others? Because Carlos, being all logical and analytical, immediately jumped to this idea about personality types.
Right. Like maybe folks who are naturally more introspective might be less susceptible to denial.
Makes sense, right? More self-awareness, less denial.
Sounds logical, but Casey actually pushes back on that pretty hard.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they argue that self-awareness isn't really tied to how you think.
So you could be like a chess master, able to think 10 steps ahead, but still lack self-awareness.
Precisely. They even compare it to having brown eyes and blonde hair.
Yeah.
Just because you have one doesn't mean you automatically have the other.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to put it. Okay, so denial can be sneaky. It's not just about intelligence. But what about the emotional side of things? Because Casey talks about individuals who lack emotional empathy as basically experiencing life in shades of gray, which is such a powerful image.
Right. It really drives home the point. They're saying that for some people, that emotional spectrum, that vividness, it just appears muted.
It's wild to imagine going through life like that without that same depth of feeling. But here's where I get a little tripped up, because if someone lacks these deep emotions, how do we explain those times when, like, totally erupt in rage? Or when they seem hell-bent on revenge if they feel wronged?
That's a great question, and it's actually something Carlos brings up too. And Casey's response really hinges on this distinction between empathy and narcissism.
Oh, okay. So it's not about genuinely connecting with another person's pain. It's more about a wounded ego.
Exactly. They're not reacting to the other person's experience. They're reacting to this perceived attack on their own sense of self-importance.
And to really hammer home this point, Casey brings up a pretty chilling example. Heinrich Himmler. Talk about a blast from the past. What does a high-ranking Nazi officer have to do with all of this?
Well, Casey's point is that Himmler, despite being intelligent, maybe even self-aware in some ways, might have lacked that emotional capacity to grasp the full weight of his actions, you know.
So you can be intelligent, even self-aware to a point, and still lack the emotional depth to truly get how your choices affect others.
Man, that is a lot to unpack, and it seems like this all ties into this idea of agency, which I have a feeling Casey and Carlos might have very different interpretations of. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into that. And we're back.
Before the break, we were really getting into this idea of denial and how it connects to self-awareness and empathy.
And how it can even show up in some pretty unexpected places.
Right. Like, who knew Heinrich Himmler would be part of this conversation? But all of this leads us to agency, which I'm really curious to dig into because something tells me Casey and Carlos might have slightly different takes on this.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because remember how Casey was talking about that grayscale world that people without much emotional depth might experience?
Right. Like, everything seems kind of muted, emotionally speaking.
Exactly. And it's almost like they're seeking out ways to actually feel something, even if it's negative.
So they're craving intensity, even if it comes from drama or conflict.
It's like they need that jolt to feel alive, to feel like they have some kind of impact.
Wow, that's kind of a bleak way to look at it, but I can see how that would play out.
Think about it like this. Imagine a little kid throwing a tantrum. They might not have the words to explain what they need, but they know that certain actions will get a reaction.
Oh, that's a good analogy. So it's like they're learning to exert control over their environment, even if it's in a really basic way.
And that becomes their way of feeling like they have agency, even if it's a really limited way of looking at it.
I can see how that gets messy really fast, mistaking control for actual agency.
Exactly. And that's where Casey makes this really important distinction between what they call a limited sense of agency, which is all about control and manipulation, and a more expanded understanding of what it means to act in the world.
Okay, I'm really intrigued by this. What does Casey mean by a more expanded understanding of agency? What does that even look like?
Well, it seems to be all about this idea of interconnectedness. Casey's saying that true agency comes from realizing that we're not just these isolated individuals, you know?
Right, like we're all part of this massive web and our actions have ripple effects.
Exactly. They affect us, sure, but they also impact everyone and everything around us.
And if you're stuck in that control and manipulation mindset, you're completely missing that bigger picture.
You're so focused on your own little corner of the web that you can't even see the intricate patterns connecting everything.
Okay, so if that's the trap, how do we break free? How do we shift from that limited view of agency to one that's more in tune with that interconnectedness?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it all circles back to self-awareness. Because if denial is us refusing to see those uncomfortable truths about ourselves, then maybe the path to greater agency starts with being willing to look inward, even when it's hard.
And I imagine that's where things get really challenging, especially for someone who's used to operating from that place of control.
Oh, absolutely. Change is tough for everyone, especially when it involves questioning those deeply held beliefs about who we are and how the world works.
So maybe it's not about forcing a different perspective on someone, but rather creating a space where they can start to examine their own assumptions.
Precisely. And maybe that starts by asking ourselves some hard questions like, why do I feel the nudge to control this situation? Or what am I afraid of if I let go?
That is such a powerful reflection. And it reminds me that this whole conversation isn't just about analyzing someone else's behavior. It's about turning that lens inward and really looking at those patterns in our own lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because true agency isn't about gaining more control. It's about developing a much deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in this grand scheme of things.
And that is a journey, not a destination.
For sure. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break. But when we come back, let's talk about what that journey might look like.
How do we even begin to cultivate that kind of self-awareness and step into that more expansive way of being in the world? Stay tuned. We'll be right back. And we are back. It's amazing how much ground we've covered, from dodging uncomfortable truths to this whole new understanding of agency.
It's like following a trail of breadcrumbs that leads us to some pretty unexpected places.
Totally. So before the break, we were talking about how to actually make that shift from that limited view of agency that's all about control to a more expansive one rooted in interconnectedness. Where do we even begin?
Well, if we circle back to what Casey was saying about denial stemming from a lack of self-awareness, maybe the first step is simply being willing to look inward, which, let's be honest, can be pretty daunting.
Especially if you've built a whole identity around being in control. It's like asking someone to step off a cliff without knowing if there's a net.
Exactly. Change is scary, especially when it comes to those fundamental beliefs we have about ourselves and the world. So I think approaching these conversations, and maybe even more importantly, our own internal dialogues with a lot of empathy is key.
So it's less about convincing someone to see things differently and more about holding space for them to maybe surprise themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Because sometimes those aha moments come when we least expect them.
And maybe it starts with us asking ourselves those tough questions like, why do I feel the need to control this situation? Or what am I so afraid of here?
Exactly. Because let's be real, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, there's usually something deeper going on beneath that need for control.
It's like that saying, scratch a cynic, find a disappointed idealist.
Right. And those deeper layers, that's where the real growth happens.
This is giving me a lot to think about, honestly. And it's a good reminder that this isn't just some theoretical exercise. We're not just here to analyze someone else's behavior. This is about all of us. It's about looking at those patterns in our own lives and seeing where we might be holding ourselves back.
Absolutely. Because true agency isn't about clinging to control. It's about understanding the interconnectedness of it all. It's about recognizing that our choices have ripple effects, that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves.
And sometimes that realization can be both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time.
Oh, for sure.
Hmm.
It's like stepping out of a tiny room into a vast, ever-expanding universe. It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this question to ponder. What small step can you take today to move towards greater self-awareness, to step into that larger view of agency, to be a part of that magnificent web of interconnectedness? Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.